welcome to the Uncover podcast.
The aim of this podcast is to explore topics, questions, and ideas that come up when reading about Jesus in the Gospels. And we're focusing especially on Luke's Gospel. But what we haven't explored yet until today is the question of the text itself. And the main question is, can we really trust what we're reading? And how can I be sure?
Well, to help us do that, we have Max Baker-Heitch here, who's an academic at the University of Oxford. So do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself before we begin?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I did my PhD in philosophy at Oxford University and finished that about 10 years ago. After that, I had a job in America at a university called the University of Notre Dame. Then came back to Oxford, and since then I've been a lecturer in philosophy at Wycliffe Hall, which is part of Oxford University, and there I teach undergraduates, I supervise PhD students, and I write academic articles and books, that kind of thing. I for a long time have been interested in questions about history, and I think it flows quite naturally, even though. So I don't kind of as an academic primarily specialize in the historical Jesus and that kind of thing. The area I do work on, the area of philosophy that I work on, epistemology and philosophy of religion, those areas concern questions to do with the nature of rationality, evidence, the nature of knowledge. And so it's always seemed quite natural for me to take a strong interest in questions about historicity when it comes to Jesus, the Gospels, and so on. And so I have tried as much as I can to immerse myself in that field of scholarship.
Amazing. It is a pleasure to have you with us. Mm-hmm. And as an academic, Max, what was your motivation getting into this area? Well, how did you end up at the University of Oxford lecturing in philosophy of religion?
Well, I became a Christian at the age of 19 as an undergraduate at the University of Exeter, studying philosophy and politics. And I actually, to be honest, wasn't all that interested in my subject prior to that. But then when I became a Christian, and that was partly through being presented, I suppose, for the first time with an intellectual case for Christianity. I suddenly kind of really came alive to all of these questions about making sense of reality, of sort of the nature of knowledge. And it seemed to me that far from kind of Christianity being in tension with philosophy, it actually opened up a space to think about all of these questions. And the idea that a rational mind is at the foundation of reality seemed to me then and still does to actually almost be a condition of the possibility of engaging in this kind of inquiry. But yeah, in terms of questions around the historical Jesus, I suppose I'd had in childhood, as most people in this country do, some exposure to Christianity, but certainly I'd never encountered the idea that there would be historical evidence for anything in the Gospels. I suppose I assumed it would be somewhat on a par with fables, or ancient Greek myths, that kind of thing. And so, it was somewhat of a surprise to encounter the fact that there is a whole field of scholarship that seriously thinks about these questions, and where even people on the more skeptical end of that scholarly spectrum would all agree that Jesus definitely was a real figure, an itinerant Jewish teacher in the first century Israel, Palestine, who ended up being crucified. And that, there's no serious doubt about at least that kind of outline of Jesus' life.
So you have evidence about Jesus, obviously, in the Gospels, and we'll kind of get onto that in a little bit. But what about evidence for just Jesus outside of what Christians, what the Gospels say?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, there are a few sources from the late 1st and early 2nd century that talk about Jesus. It's, I think, fair to say they're quite bare bones, but what they do say fits perfectly well with what the Gospels say about Jesus. So Josephus. He was a Jewish kind of aristocrat. He had in the war between the Romans and the Jews in that ended in 70 AD. Josephus ended up switching sides and then ended up on the Roman side through a complicated series of events, and was able to spend his life, the rest of his life, kind of writing a history basically of his own people, of the Jewish people. And so he does talk a lot about events in the first century, and he has a paragraph that talks about Jesus. And actually, I should just mention, there's been a really important book with Oxford University Press by a scholar called Thomas Schmidt very recently, arguing, I think, really robustly that the passage in Josephus where he talks about Jesus has all of the stylistic fingerprint of Jesus in terms of how often he uses certain words and phrases compared to in the rest of his writings. And I think he's made a really good case that this is an authentic passage from Josephus. And it says basically, Jesus was known as a wise man, a teacher. He had a reputation for performing miracles. He gained a significant following, and he ended up being crucified under Pontius Pilate, and that his followers claimed that they saw him alive again afterwards. And so, as I said, it's quite bare bones, but it's kind of got all, arguably the highlights, if you want, if you were just really paring down what you would get from Jesus in the New Testament, it fits very well, I think.
And I guess rather like remaining skeptical about that person of Jesus as well, because he's not necessarily writing about Jesus historically as, okay, this is God coming down to earth, or even that Jesus did all these miracles, but actually it's claimed that Jesus did these things. Known as a wise teacher, claimed to have done miracles. People say he rose again from the dead. He's not necessarily taken a solid stance.
That's absolutely right. No, and Josephus wasn't ever a Christian. He didn't become a Christian. But he clearly thinks that Jesus really lived. And Josephus had good access to information about Jesus' life. He was born in 37 AD in Jerusalem. He knew, Thomas Schmidt, this scholar I mentioned, has made a strong case that Josephus knew various people who would have been present at Jesus's trial.
Interesting.
So, and it's actually interesting on the miracles point that there are quite a number of references in, and Josephus being one of them, but there are others besides, including the Jewish Talmud, actually. It's a collection of rabbinic writings that mention Jesus. And in all of the cases, they mention this reputation for miracle working. They don't deny it. They simply attribute the source of it to something other than God. So in the Talmud, he is claimed to have been a sorcerer, so basically working dark powers. But it's interesting. No source that we know of from antiquity denies that Jesus was a miracle worker. It's just a question of who's giving him the power, as it were.
Yeah, really interesting.
So in that, if we do understand that he is real and that he actually walked on this earth, as you're saying, it's important how we interpret him as a person. And so why is it important that Luke's gospel that we are reading here is reliable to us?
Yeah. Well, I think if someone is going to consider, as it were, kind of staking their whole life on Jesus, then I think it's reasonable to want an account that gives us an accurate portrait of what this person was like. And so, I have every respect for someone who wants to do their due diligence, as it were, and ask these kinds of questions and not just kind of take it on trust that Christians say this is the word of God. And so, but actually, and the beauty is that we can ask these kinds of questions, and I would want to suggest there are satisfying answers to them.
I think that's really a fair point as well, because if you're talking about what Christians across ages and all eras, and where it comes at such a cost to be a Christian, it is that question: is this actually true? Can I actually stake my life on Jesus that I can really know about primarily through the Gospels.
Yeah.
That question then of reliability or trust is then really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really important. And going into, I guess, Luke's Gospel specifically, how do we know how it came about, who Luke is, authorship? What can you say about the kind of origins of Luke's Gospel?
Yeah, great. Well, shall we start by talking about the author and who he might have been?
Yeah.
Well, so the first thing to say here is I think that there's basically two types of evidence that scholars will look at concerning the authorship of a text. The first is what can be gleaned from the text itself about the author. That would include if the text says, this is me, Max, writing this, whatever. But they wouldn't necessarily just say, oh, it says it's written by this person, therefore it is. They'd want to test that a bit. In the case of the Gospels, none of the Gospels say, I am Luke writing this document. Okay, so that doesn't mean there aren't other clues we can look for in the text as to who might have written it. But so yeah, that would be called internal evidence. We'll come back to that maybe in terms of what the internal evidence says here in the case of Luke. Then there's external evidence, which is what have later people who, the earliest audiences who've read this document, what did they think about who wrote it? What did they say? And that's where really we get this idea that it was written by someone called Luke. So from basically the middle of the 2nd century onwards, we've got versions of the manuscript of Luke's Gospel that have the title. And in all cases, it's the same, kata Lukan in Greek, which means according to Luke. And there's never any variant version. There's never any version that says according to Philip or something.
Yeah,
it's always the same. And that's interesting in itself. I think there was a German scholar, Martin Hengel, who made this point that the titles for the Gospels we do get them whenever we have a version of the manuscript which is complete enough to have the title. We never have any variant versions of the titles. They're always the same.
Yeah. Okay.
And he suggests that this does suggest these titles went back quite a lot earlier than the manuscripts we have of them, because for there to be such uniformity suggests that it's not the case that some people over in Rome are saying it was written by someone called Philip, and whereas Christians over in Antioch are saying something different. It doesn't seem like that's a good scenario to explain what we have here. So, but of course, then you still want to say, but who's this Luke? And we also do have texts from the 2nd century. So there's one called the Muratorian Canon, which is basically like an early list of books that you could see as like a proto version of the New Testament canon. It's still developing a bit. So there's some, but the 4 Gospels are all in there. Paul's letters are in there. And it has little bits of information, including that Luke was a physician who traveled with Paul on some of Paul's journeys, and that he's the author. So that's the external evidence. But I would have to say that modern scholars are generally approach the external evidence with a high degree of suspicion, arguably too much so. But they will put much more weight on what they think they can sleuth out by looking internally at clues in the text.
What are the internal clues in the text? If that's okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, okay. The most important one for Luke's Gospel is, well, first we need to say something about the fact that Luke, the Gospel of Luke, as we know it, is also almost certainly written by the same person as the Acts of the Apostles, or the Book of Acts, which basically picks up where the Gospel of Luke leaves off and narrates the story of the growth of the early church, right? And there's really hard, virtually no modern scholar doubts that Luke and Acts are written by the same author. Okay, and so a really important internal clue to who is the author is the fact that in the Book of Acts, from chapter 16, verse 10 onwards, you get the author sometimes narrates things like, we crossed over from this port to this port. So it seems like the author's implying that he was personally present with accompanying the Apostle Paul on some of his journeys. And now, you wouldn't be surprised to know that there's been debate in scholarship about how to best make sense of these we sections, as they're called. And you've kind of got a small number of options, really. One is that it's a literary device, that it doesn't really mean he's claiming to be there. It's just like it's just a literary device that the author's using for some reason. The massive problem with that is that if it were that, why is it confined to these very specific sections which have geographical continuity? They pick up and leave off in the same places. They're not even really the most exciting parts of the book of Acts. And it would just be bizarre that if it's some kind of literary device to make it more interesting, that he's done it in such a targeted, specific way. And there's just no really good parallels like that in other ancient literature for a historical work that uses we in a fictional way. Another option is that it is really someone's first person recollections, but Luke the author has taken someone else's diary and made it look like it's his own recollections. But the problem with that is that as we might get onto this in a minute, the Gospel of Luke has a sort of preface explaining why he wrote it, and he addresses it to a specific individual, Theophilus. And it's typically thought this was like Luke's patron who was kind of sponsoring him to write this. And so Theophilus and Luke's audience more generally would have known whether Luke was being deceptive by making it look like it's his own recollections. And also, Luke appears to be a very careful editor of his sources. So something else we might get onto, he clearly has had access to other historical documents talking about Jesus and has kind of woven them together in his own. And he's been very careful in the way he's done that. With Mark's gospel, for instance, he's improved Mark's grammar sometimes, and Mark's a bit rough and ready sometimes. But why would Luke be so careless as to leave someone else's we, first person pronouns, in a text when that wasn't the case? So I think the best solution, and the one that the scholar Craig Keener says probably a slight majority of scholars now accept, is that it is Luke, it is the author's own first person plural in those sections, and if that's right, then that means the author did accompany Paul, including when he went to Jerusalem in the late 50s AD, and would have had a chance to speak with people who had been eyewitnesses to Jesus's ministry.
So then, sorry, Joanna. So what I'm getting so far is that Luke was kind of tasked by Theophilus to kind of create this account, and then Luke was traveling with Paul, like documenting almost like a film crew in the office, where they're just sitting there documenting what's going on, recording the information of what's happening. And then when he was in Jerusalem, late 50s AD, then that's probably where he kind of created this account of Jesus' life. Through the three eyewitnesses of those stories of people that really were there, walked with Jesus, interacted with him, heard his teachings, saw his miracles.
Yeah, so in Acts 20, when they arrive in Jerusalem, and this is one of the we sections, they meet James, the brother of Jesus. So that already indicates he's got access to family members of Jesus. And incidentally, that one thought, scholar Richard Borkham has suggested that maybe Luke, that's how Luke had access to the story from Mary, the mother of Jesus, via Jesus' brother James. If we don't know, Mary may not have been alive by then, but nonetheless, James, the brother of Jesus, was, and Luke got to meet him. But yeah, that's right. Now, in terms of when Luke finally brought it all together and polished it, and we don't know, but in terms of when he had access to the information, I think we can be confident that it was during the lifetimes of eyewitnesses. But yeah, it may have been a few years later when he finally published it as in the form that we now know it.
So why would he write this then?
Yeah, I mean, I think this may be where it's useful to look at the opening verses of Luke's gospel, where unlike the other gospels that don't sort of quite give us this preface explaining the purpose of writing, Luke does give us this.
Yeah, do you want me to read Luke 1 from the start? Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught.
Yeah, thank you. So I think it gives us a really nice window into Luke's motivations for writing. So we've got this person, Theophilus, who seems to be probably Luke's patron. He may have even helped Luke financially, because it would have been expensive to travel around do all this research. And what's interesting is that he says, basically Theophilus has already heard these stories about Jesus. So Luke's role looks to be not so much finding out information afresh for Theophilus, so much as confirming what Theophilus has already been taught, right? And so Luke talks about how many others have undertaken to do this. So that right there is, scholars would say, well, Luke is tipping us off that he's got access to prior written sources about Jesus. You would think at least two, probably more than that. But the ones that scholars can trace quite confidently would be, one of them would be Mark's gospel. So it does look as though Mark's gospel was the first to be written. And as I said, it's sort of in its grammar and style, it's quite rough and ready, and it's very action packed. Luke seems to have had access to Mark's gospel and has used quite a lot of the material there, which shows that Luke was behaving as a responsible biographer would. And incidentally, a good explanation for why Luke would want to use Mark's gospel is that Mark's gospel was known from the earliest times as essentially being the memoir of the Apostle Peter. Is written up by this figure, John Mark, who was a companion of Peter. And so it makes a lot of sense why Luke would want access to that. But then clearly Luke's got material in his gospel that's not found in any of the others. And so, for example, some of the parables that many people will know, like the Good Samaritan, the parable of the prodigal son. And so Luke, clearly in the course of his own research, he encountered material about Jesus that he didn't find in his existing written sources that he had access to. And so it looks as though, and actually it's been noted that the way he talks about, consulting pre-existing materials, and he uses this word autoptes, which is a Greek word which means eyewitness. So he had a concern for eyewitness testimony. He seems to be signaling that he has gone about this in the way that the tradition of historical writing, which was strong in that time, and Luke would have been aware of the writings of people like Thucydides or Polybius, and he seems to have been in that tradition himself, trying to write a carefully investigated history of the life of Jesus and the early church that depended as much as possible on eyewitnesses.
Yeah. So what Luke has then created is that historical document pretty much at its center, based then from eyewitness testimonies. Is there anything that we can see almost externally that can validate what Luke writes is true, legitimate. It's authentic, I guess, to history, rather than kind of stories that are fabricated or made up or exaggerated.
No, absolutely. So I think one quite general point that I think is really important. So obviously we haven't yet talked about when Luke may have written. I think, generally scholars would place it somewhere between the 60s AD and 90 AD, somewhere in there. And it's kind of, because the fact is any of those would be compatible with a traveling companion of Paul. So I'm inclined to think it doesn't matter that much when in that window it was. But the key thing is that at the time Luke was writing this gospel, the Christian movement had really kind of got going in a big way and was spreading across the Mediterranean world. And things that were of concern to the early Christians at that point were not necessarily at all an issue during Jesus' ministry 30, 40 years earlier. And so it's really interesting if we found Jesus in Luke's gospel saying things about issues that we know were a concern for the early church in the 60s or 70s AD, that were not probably an issue in Jesus' historical ministry in Galilee and Judea, that would make us think this does seem to be more like the kind of document that's back projecting stories onto Jesus for the purposes of the early church. But actually what we see is, so just for example, we know that the issue of whether Gentiles, let's say non-Jews, should be circumcised in order to become Christians was a huge issue among the early Christians. And we see that in Paul's letters. It was a really tricky topic. And you would expect that if the Gospels were kind of shaping Jesus' words and deeds to, for their own purposes, he would have said something on these types of issues, but he doesn't say anything on the issue of circumcision. And instead, some of the things he talks about were issues that really had no relevance to the early Christians 3 decades later. And so that looks as though it's preserving what actually happened in the context of Jesus' ministry rather than what would have been useful to say about Jesus from a later vantage point.
Yeah, and so if it was fabricated, then it would have been really, really easy then for Luke just to be able to say, and Jesus said this, which would have spoken into that culture or the audience that he's writing to specifically. But because they're not a part of the text within that, I guess, that age and the issues prevalent at that time, it just suggests then that what Luke then is actually accounting for, or what he's recording, is then what Jesus actually did, what he said, what he taught.
Yeah, exactly. So one example of this, what Luke records fitting with Jesus' real context rather than what might have been useful later is, it's a small, you might think it sounds a small thing, but it's quite significant actually. It's the way that, so in the mouths of characters in Luke's gospel, the way Jesus is referred to is very in keeping with how he likely was referred to during his ministry. So people will call him typically Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the son of the carpenter, Jesus the Galilean. And and just to come on to something about names a bit more in a minute, because it's quite significant, but Jesus was perhaps the 5th most common male name in Jesus' time and place. And so there were loads of Jesuses. So you needed to distinguish which Jesus are we talking about, right? And so it makes perfect sense that you would refer to him in these different ways. Jesus, the son of the carpenter, Jesus of Nazareth, the Galilean, that kind of thing, the son of Joseph. And these are all ways that we find in the Gospels that the characters refer to him. Even though by the time the Gospels were being written, Jesus for Christians could only mean one person. And normally it would be with exalted titles like the Lord Jesus, but that's not how the characters in the Gospels refer to him. And so that's another marker of capturing the original kind of context on the ground rather than how it looked to Christians 30 years later, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I didn't actually know that I didn't notice that detail actually, that is not referred to in the Gospels actually, the Lord Jesus or anything of that sort. So do you think that differentiates it from any other historical texts of that time?
So it's a useful comparison might be with the Gospel of Thomas, actually. So this is one of these other so-called Gospels that, sometimes it's been claimed, like by Dan Brown in the Da Vinci Code, that, there were all these other Gospels and, Constantine in the 4th century called a council to decide which were the ones they wanted and which they didn't. And now that's just mistaken on many levels. One thing is, so the Gospel of Thomas was almost certainly written much later than the 4 Gospels in the New Testament. But it's quite telling to just look at the character of the Gospel of Thomas in terms of the Gospel of Luke, for example, is stuffed full of authentic information about the geography of Jerusalem, Judea, Galilee, the names of local rulers, the accurate knowledge about travel routes through the land, all of this kind of thing. The Gospel of Thomas, by contrast, contains just one geographical reference, which Judea, which is so vague and general that you wouldn't have to have any knowledge of the land to be able to use that. So yeah, it's worth just kind of getting a sense of Luke's knowledge of the time and place Jesus lived in. So Luke doesn't just know famous places like Jerusalem. He knows the names of loads of small towns and villages, which we know through independent means were real places. So Bethany, Bethphage, Bethsaida, Capernaum, Jericho, Nain, Nazareth. What's interesting as well is he knows some local place names in the language of Aramaic, which was a dialect somewhat similar to Hebrew that was spoken by Jews in the land of Judea and Galilee, but not by Jews in other parts of the Roman Empire who would have spoken Greek. So it's very local to that area. And Luke accurately uses some Aramaic terms, Hakaldema, which means field of blood. He's talking about the place that Judas bought and committed suicide in. Golgotha, the place of the skull, for example. So it would be very surprising if Luke was just sort of making stuff up or somewhat guessing from a distance that he would get accurate Aramaic place names. He knows things about travel routes between. So basically, you think of the land. So Jerusalem is in what was then known as Judea, the surrounding region, and that's kind of in the south. You've got the Dead Sea next to it, sort of down a bit, and that's Jerusalem is up in the mountains, and then about 70 miles north, you've got Galilee, which is and you've got this little lake surrounded by farming country, and so Galilee, that's where Jesus grows up and has a lot of his early ministry. And Luke knows that there are 2 travel routes between Judea and Galilee. One was through this area in the middle called Samaria, which was actually quite dangerous for Jews to travel through because there was a difficult history between the Jews and the Samaritans. And in Luke's gospel, at one point, Jesus and his disciples get refused safe passage through Samaria. And that's very realistic to how things might have been. And it was that kind of thing that meant that a lot of Jews traveling from Galilee down to Jerusalem would have gone via the Jordan River through the Jordan River Valley, which was very hot and dry, but it was kind of safer. And then they'd come up past Jericho, up into the hill country, past villages like Bethany, and then they'd see Jerusalem. And so Luke clearly knows about all of this kind of stuff. And it bears mentioning as well, I think, that because Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD after a war, that Jerusalem after that was very different than how it had been before. And yet Luke and the other gospel writers get Jerusalem right as it was before that. So it's not like, it's not a scenario where a tourist can just kind of rock up in Jerusalem in 80 AD and figure out, oh, this would be the kind of thing that they did. And you had these places because it had changed so much.
And so kind of bringing this together a little bit, the place names that Luke mentions, the people that he writes about that were kind of the eyewitnesses of the time of Jesus, and then even just the geographical details, the travel, the place, all of that really then suggests that this can't be a document that was created or fabricated then like after those eyewitness accounts. Because even, I guess, you talk about the last example of Jerusalem, if Jerusalem was destroyed with 70 AD and then rebuilt, it'd be different to then what then Jesus entered into it. So then you can take all of this information and then creates that understanding then that Luke really then is true in what he is writing about. What he's writing about can be trusted. It can be a truthful document that is like not fiction, but just fact.
No, that's right. And if it's all right, just to mention one other piece of external evidence of reliability, which I think is very interesting. In the last, 15, 20 years, this has become something that scholars have become aware of, is that the personal names of characters in Luke's gospel and the other gospels as well, in terms of like which names were popular, which names were rare, which names would you have to disambiguate by saying things like Jesus, the son of the carpenter, or Simon, the brother of Andrew, versus which names would you not need to do that for, because there's hardly anyone called Bartholomew, for example. I'm not sure if that's actually right in terms of that one being rare, but the general point is the Gospels seem to have that information really accurately. So there's an Israeli archaeologist called Tal Elan put together a database of about 2,500 names of male people who really lived and died in the sort of 2 centuries either side of Jesus. She wasn't doing it for the purpose of researching Jesus. And then about 500 or so female names. And you can then do some really interesting tests to see how representative are the names in the Gospels. So if you look at the name Simon, for example, it turns out to be one of the most popular, if not the most popular male name in the real population at the time, according to the archaeologists' database. And it's also the most popular male name in the Gospels. And actually there's been, there's a paper by an American scholar called Luke van der Vee and a statistician, Jason Wilson, who ran formal statistical tests on this to show that actually these names are the sort of relative popularity of the names in the Gospels is really authentic to the actual popularity of the names at the time. And that's not something, I mean, a gospel author wouldn't have even occurred to them that anyone could run that kind of test. But also there's no way they would have had the kind of population level data to be able to try and fabricate something like that.
I think it's interesting how the difference between the Gospels and the historical texts proves their sort of reliability. But actually, when you look at the Gospels themselves and compare them against each other, they are actually different. And does that come into anything at all in discrediting or?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And it's one of the things that troubles people the most when trying to get to grips with the Gospels. So I would say, on the one hand, there's kind of differences in emphasis, differences in style, and clearly that there are those. Luke seems to have particular emphases. He's perhaps highlighted Jesus' compassion for the poor, especially. And whereas maybe Matthew's wanted to highlight Jesus as a teacher and as sort of fulfilling messianic expectations, right? So there's those kinds of differences, but then there are more specifically apparent contradictions between some of the stories. So one thing I would say in general is that, people who are used to dealing with eyewitness testimony and comparing testimonies will typically tell you that what you're really looking for in good eyewitness testimony, when you're looking at, say, two people testifying about a crime, what you really want, or what you expect to see if they're being honest and reliable, is they will overlap on kind of a core of events, but then there will be difference of emphasis. And there will even be often apparent tensions or contradictions between minor details. And far from undermining confidence, it actually increases confidence that they are genuinely two independent perspectives. And so I think that's really helpful to bear in mind. So, and let's look at a specific example in the Gospels. So, the women at the tomb, right? In Luke 24, Luke tells us about how some women followers of Jesus came to the tomb early on the first Sunday morning after his crucifixion and found that the stone rolled back. And Luke says that the women there, and this is Luke 24, verse 10, were Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and others. And when people sometimes are troubled by the fact that when you look at the other Gospels, there are slightly different lists of women. Now, actually, I would suggest that there's a perfectly kind of innocent explanation for this. But even before we get to that, I think the very fact that the Gospel authors have not tried to fix their lists, as it were, to make sure they all line up, is not something we would expect if they're going out of their way to fabricate something. The other thing is, actually, it's quite clear that Luke has a particular interest in some of the women followers of Jesus, and a scholar called Richard Borkham has made a good case, I think, that Luke had personal access to some of these followers of Jesus. In particular, Joanna may have been someone Luke spoke to. And so actually it makes quite a lot of sense that Luke would highlight the names of particular witnesses that he himself has spoken to. And so I don't think there's a contradiction there. There's a difference of emphasis, and it may well be an emphasis owing to which witnesses a given gospel author has had closest access to. But I think that's relatively representative of the kinds of things, the kinds of differences you'll get between the Gospels.
Yeah. So that's really interesting thinking about that, isn't it? Because if you have 4 accounts writing the same thing,
right,
then that feels like it could be just corroborated, it could be put together, fabricated. But because they're coming at it with different angles or personalities, that suggests a real eyewitness account, because you remember certain details. Each one might impact a little bit differently, and all with their own personality. So I guess what you see then within Luke's gospel is that as Luke has written it, it feels really like a true historical document. How has this changed, I guess, as it's being translated? Because what we're doing now is we're reading this like 2,000 years later. Could these stories have been exaggerated? Could they be changed? Could they have been altered from then to where we are now?
Yeah, that's a very fair question. Yeah, so I would want to draw a sort of line between 2 types of questions. So I think mostly what we've been talking about up to this point is, what was that process like, or how can we trust that process of going from eyewitnesses to Luke writing stuff down? But then, how can we be sure that what we are reading now is this basically the same as the text Luke wrote down? Yeah, so that's the discipline that's known as textual criticism. It is, and it's the branch of scholarship that's concerned with, looking at manuscripts that we have and where there are some differences between them. Trying to figure out which is most likely the original version. Now, I should say, because I've mentioned variations between manuscripts, that might set alarm bells ringing for someone, but it's worth putting that in context. So Matthew's gospel has about 1,070 verses, of which only 35 are affected by variants that the scholarly committee that put together the kind of official, as it were, Greek text of the New Testament that scholars would use today, only 35 out of over 1,000 verses that they deemed variations that they deemed as affecting meaning in any way. And even there, they almost never affect meaning in a significant way that could have any kind of theological implications.
So you're talking, that was 35 of over 1,000.
Yeah.
Verses, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I think it's really important to put that in context. Yeah. But then, yes, that there is this discipline of textual criticism that will look at where there are sort of two different versions, two manuscripts that have a different version of a verse, and try and figure out which is most likely the original. So I think it's important to note the fact that the number of manuscript copies of the New Testament that we have and the earliness of them is basically unparalleled by any other text in the ancient world. I'll just read this quote from a pair of scholars, Bruce Metzger and Bart Ehrman, and these are two of the top scholars in the field of textual criticism. Bart Ehrman is worth noting. He is sometimes thought of in popular culture as being someone who's really skeptical about these issues, but listen to what these two scholars say. They say the textual critic of the New Testament is embarrassed by a wealth of material. Furthermore, the work of many ancient authors has been preserved only in manuscripts that date from the Middle Ages, sometimes the late Middle Ages, far removed from the time at which they were written. On the contrary, the time gap between the composition of the books of the New Testament and the earliest existing copies is relatively brief. Instead of the lapse of a millennium or more, as is the case for not a few classical authors, several papyrus manuscripts of portions of the New Testament are extant that were copied within a century or so after the composition of the original documents. So so I think we can be confident that the text of the New Testament as we have it today is basically the same as the original that was written down. You did bring up the issue of translation as well. And so the nice thing is that scholars today will work from a copy of the Greek New Testament. So this is a kind of a critical text of the Greek New Testament as it's known. And what that is a committee of scholars has got all of the earliest and best manuscripts and have sort of put together a text of the New Testament that's based on that, including the very few places where there's some doubt about the meaning of a given verse because there are variants, and they have quite refined methodologies for trying to figure out which is the most likely the original, and so that's what they've produced, and that's what scholars are working from. So of course, there are better and worse translations of the Bible, but ultimately, we're not actually dependent on any translation of the Bible in that sense.
Yeah, sure. So then the language isn't being updated almost constantly. Each transition. What you have is, the Greek scripture.
That's right.
And then always translating from the original text.
Yes, that's right.
What I guess date do we have that Greek text from? Like, how is that dating?
Okay, so I mean the manuscripts that have been used primarily to make up this will come from really mostly from the first 4 centuries after the New Testament was written. And just to put that in perspective, Tacitus's Annals of Imperial Rome, which is a really important text about Imperial Rome by Tacitus, who was a Roman writer in the early 2nd century. We have only 2 copies of that text, only 2 manuscript copies of that text in total. They're partial, so between them they cover the whole thing, and they both are from almost 1,000 years after. But there's no real doubts that we've basically got the original text there. So whereas by contrast, we've got hundreds of fragments of the New Testament from the first 3 centuries. And then we've got these big, what are called codex documents. This is like the entire New Testament and actually the Greek translation of the Old Testament all under one cover.
Wow.
So a good example, you can go and see it at the British Library, the Codex Sinaiticus. It's from the 4th century, and it has the entire New Testament plus the Greek version of the Old Testament. And there's several others like it from within that sort of rough time period. And so really in the scheme of things, that's very close in time to the originals.
Yeah. And so we're saying if we can trust something like Tacitus, and then we can absolutely trust something like the New Testament.
Yeah, I think that sums it up perfectly, really. Do you not think? And my hope anyway, for anyone watching this after hearing all that, would be that you can rest in the fact that Luke's gospel is reliable and move forward with that and take what he says and what he writes down as truth and real fact. And that can then be your next focus and help shape your relationship with God in that way. You might already have an Uncover Luke book. These are easily accessed from your local Christian union, and it just goes through Luke's gospel with questions that you might have, and you can go through them with either a friend. You might know someone who would want to go through Uncover Luke with you, or again, you can reach out to your local Christian unions and ask them if they would go through it with you. And you can do that easily by Instagram or through their website. But I would definitely recommend, we all would recommend the Uncover Luke. And as we've just learned, Luke's gospel is definitely a reliable source to learn about Jesus. So I hope that you read through it and discover for yourself what Jesus' life can teach each of us still, even here to this day.
Great. Max, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate all of the study and the wisdom that you've done over many years into this. What we'd like to do is end with a question that you get to ask our audience. Is there anything that you want to ask them that they can go away and ponder?
I suppose almost I would say if someone's reading the Gospel of Luke for the first time and are not yet sure what to think about Jesus, almost put yourself in the shoes of Luke. And if the things we've been talking about hold up, and Luke is a credible historian who is drawing on eyewitnesses, and so he's giving us an accurate portrait, I think it would be to put yourselves in the shoes of Luke, the investigator, and ask yourself who is the man that this portrait is painting.
Thanks, Max. That is great for us to be able to all go away and really ponder with. And thank you again for joining us for this episode. Thank you, Joanna.
Thank you.
As we kind of wrap this up, I think it's really helpful for us just to be able to reflect through what we're discussing today and take that invitation, I guess, seriously, to just really think through who is Jesus. And I do pray that as you go on this journey, you'll be able to come and just know him for yourself. So I'll leave that with you. Thank you so much for listening, and hopefully we'll see you again next time.